Storytelling is an innately limited thing, and the number one goal of most storytellers is to make their audience forget that for a while. A good story can create the illusion of a vast world of infinite possibility and countless vibrant characters, but it's mostly smoke and mirrors. Every story has an extremely limited and finite scope. A movie only has its runtime, a book its word count, a TV show its season order, and that's all the space the storyteller has to pack in the plot and core cast in such a way that it implies a world more vast and immersive than any story could ever actually put on screen. For a story to be immersive, the audience has to believe the world has enough depth to immerse them, but while reality is oceanic in its complexity, a fictional story can never be deeper than a particularly well-decorated swimming pool. And of the various mediums of storytelling, video games are in a bit of a rough spot when it comes to creating the illusion of scope. Because unlike most other mediums, the audience of a video game is an active participant, and while most stories can obfuscate the line between important plot stuff and thin background set dressing that's just there to make the world feel more real, a player in a video game can find that line, and the more they play, the more likely they are to develop an extremely immersion-breaking understanding of what small fraction of the game is actually important and what is just there to look pretty. What storylines, items, and conversations are actually critical for quest progression, and what's just extra fluff. The longer a player interacts with a game and the more exploration they attempt that the game can't keep up with, the less vast and immersive the game will inevitably feel, which can be a problem because most games are intentionally challenging, which means the player won't just breeze through everything on their first try, which means they're going to have to replay parts of it, whether that's just figuring out the beats of a tricky boss fight or going through the whole game again in search of a true ending. But replay is the fastest way to wring the impact out of a story. Characters that seem vibrant and complex when you're playing out the script of the main storyline will suddenly become flat cardboard caricatures as soon as their unique dialogue is spent, and all you can get them to say is the same set of 1 to 6 filler lines communicating the same net zero information. A boss fight that feels terrifying and unpredictable breaks down to a rote set of telegraphed moves the more a player fights them. Glitches and bugs are the number one immersion breaker for games, but in my experience, nothing wrings the depth out of a game more efficiently than playing it too many times. And there's nothing that can be done about this. A game cannot contain infinite content. If you play it for long enough, it'll run out of surprises. There's a modern trend in game design that I find intriguingly self-defeating, which is games that forego conclusive endings in favor of endless post-game content. The player can just keep playing the game forever after it's expended all its unique story and scripting, giving the player access to a playable post-victory happy ending that kind of reduces both the happiness and the endingness of a more typical game over you win situation. Now it feels like the characters are sort of consigned to an endless purgatory of looping mechanics, no forward progress to be made because there is no more progress to be had. This is as good as it'll ever get for them. Playable post-game is not intended as an existential nightmare, and I do have a lot of fun with some games post-games, but I don't really think there's any other way to interpret a scenario where we gradually learn that the world that seems vast and full of endless potential is actually thinly spread and quickly exhausted. As the player's progress grows towards 100% completion and the game runs out of challenges for them, we experience a haunting sensation of outgrowing this reality. We've become too powerful, too well-traveled. There are no more worlds to conquer, and the world that once seemed so vast and inviting now constantly reminds us of how small it really is. And it's this special circle of hell that I'd like to explore today through the trope of the time loop. A time loop is basically what happens when you apply that tortuous logic of replaying a video game way too many times to a character within a story. Either through their own power or through some frequently inexplicable twist of fate beyond their control, a character begins reliving the same short interval of time over and over again, usually no more than a few days. Outside of the looping character, everything plays out the same every time. Non-looping secondary characters will say the same lines, make the same decisions given the same input, etc. Time loops are a form of time travel, which I already have a trope talk about, but time loop stories are structurally extremely different than standard time travel narratives and explore very different plots and arcs. So I think they're well worth their own day in the limelight. Or, as it may happen, the same day over and over again. Hey-oh! Look, there are too many easy jokes I could be making, but I don't have the patience to make you loop through this video or to redo the intro 7 times. The thing about time loops is that they are annoying to be in, and that means any joke I make about being in a time loop will therefore be annoying. Which actually brings up an important point. There's a very structural difference between time loops that the looping character has no control over versus time loops that a character is doing on purpose. The primary difference is that a character trapped in a time loop is probably going to look for a way out of it because being in a time loop sucks. Once they figure out time isn't moving forward, they're going to be very invested in finding out why and how they can stop it. But if a character has some sort of time loop ability that they're doing doing on purpose, or at least know how to theoretically stop, the objective of the story isn't usually going to center on getting out of the loop, it's going to center on something else, usually the accomplishment of some seemingly insurmountable task. This is because the structure of a time loop story gives the looping character functionally infinite time to figure out a finite scenario. They have a window of time from a few minutes to a few days, and everything that happens in that window of time will happen the same way every time if they don't do something to change it. Essentially, this is the part of the time loop narrative that maps to that really tricky boss fight you've been trying to beat. The fight's on a timer, and the boss's moves are really unforgiving, and you zigged when you should have zagged, and now you're a player pancake and you gotta start the whole thing all over again. A time loop of this variety basically puts the looping character in the position of a player trying to get really good at one specific super annoying challenge. The first time through, before they realize they're in a loop, the story will drive home how unthinkably challenging this scenario really is, usually by killing them in a nasty way. But after they loop and realize death is only a reset button, they'll start getting good, trying new tactics, building up muscle memory, not making the same mistake twice. Over the course of the loops, the character can refine their strategy to absolute laser precision, because the thing they're fighting is a huge challenge, yeah, but it's also a predictable one. Now, the trick is, these two time loop narratives look very different, but they actually break down to the same beats. While a character trapped in a time loop is primarily trying to find a way out of it, usually the way they end up doing that is by accomplishing some seemingly insurmountable challenge. In the classic example of Groundhog Day, it turns out our nominal hero can't escape the loop until he character develops into such a genuinely good person that it makes his coworker fall in true love with him in 24 hours. A nearly impossible task, especially for someone who starts off as such a massive jerk and is never actually told that this is the goal he has to accomplish, making it more of a natural evolution of his character development than something with a perverse incentive. And while a character who has control over the loops isn't trapped by the time loop, they're usually still trapped by the insurmountable challenge they need to use the loops to beat, so that when they do leave the loops, they don't just get immediately bodied. In Edge of Tomorrow, our hero learns on like loop 4 that he'll stop looping if he receives a hefty enough blood transfusion. But if he does that, the ongoing alien invasion is going to straight up win within like 48 hours. Whether that unlikely victory is their release condition or just their own personal goal, it calculates out the same. Our hero can leave the time loop only after they accomplish some challenge, and the time loops give them the time and practice they need to make that happen. And that's the simple shape of it. Structurally, time loop plots are very basic, and topologically, pretty much all the same. This is not a bad thing, because what a time loop plot really is a crucible for the forging of character development. The most interesting part of a time loop story is almost always going to be what it does to the looping character, and what they choose to do to the world around them. To start with, a time loop story carves away a huge chunk of the foundations of typical story structure by making the looping character's actions have no lasting consequences. Characters grappling with the consequences of their decisions is like 90% of most stories. In a time loop, that drops to 0. Suddenly, the character can do whatever they want, and none of it will follow them into their next loop. Long-term and even short-term consequences of their actions don't matter. It's not uncommon for characters to spend at least a few loops just doing whatever they want with wild abandon, which is a very revelatory thing for an audience to see. Who is this character when their actions stop mattering? There's a trope called What You Are in the Dark, which does something similar. Put a character in a challenging situation where nobody will ever know what decision they make. They could do something absolutely self-serving or cruel, or they could just passively enable something terrible for their own benefit. Whatever they do, good or bad, nobody will know to blame them or to praise them. Who is this character when they have no one to hold them accountable but themselves? Sticking a character in a time loop will also demonstrate this with interest, because we don't just see the character make that decision once. What You Are in the Dark shows a very deep and foundational core of the character, but the character in a time loop has nothing but time to undergo character development. It's revelatory to see a character spend their early time loops robbing banks, or crashing cars, or gaslighting women into sleeping with him. Groundhog Day is a horror movie, and I will stand by that, but it's also revelatory to see that character change. In the final loop of Groundhog Day, we see our protagonist has built a daily routine out of saving everyone he can in town from everything, from minor inconveniences to potentially deadly hazards. And it's clear he's been at this for a while, given how much practice he has. When the day resets, he'll have to do it all over again, and none of them will ever know the extent of what he's done for them. There is no lasting consequence to any of his actions, good or bad, and while in the early loops that meant that he reveled in getting away with bad things in a context nobody could judge or punish him for, by the end of it he's become the kind of person who does everything he can to alleviate suffering in everyone around him, even if none of it will last and he'll have to choose to do it all over again tomorrow. The time loop story shows us what happens to a character when they're forced to play out their entire character arc in an extremely limited context. While most stories will develop their characters slowly and reveal new and interesting sides to them by placing them in new and challenging scenarios, a time loop holds the scenario constant and sees how the character changes when forced to grapple with the same situation over and over again. There is also the question, in some stories where the character is trapped in a time loop, what possibilities are they willing to explore to free them from the loop? In Groundhog Day, Phil thinks that maybe the groundhog is at fault, so in one of the loops he tries a Groundhog groundhog murder-suicide, and it doesn't work. But there's that question. If Phil thought, hey, maybe I can't get out of this loop unless I kill everybody, would he be willing to try that? And how long would he stay in the loop before he was willing to try that? There's elements of existential horror that are just laced through this entire trope, and it's very, very easy to play it for implied or explicit on-screen horror, because we don't know what happens in the loops we don't see. Anyway, this is a tangent, but my point is, time loops are frequently used to drive characters to extremes that they would, under normal circumstances where consequences matter, never ever be willing to do. And there's an interesting question there about what that reveals about the character. What does it reveal about a character to see what they do and become when they are beyond the point of desperation, in a context where their actions really don't have lasting consequences for the most part? There's probably a whole other video that could be made about how to judge the morality of actions within time loops, but the good news is I don't have to do that because Jacob Geller already made the time loop nihilism video, so just go watch that instead. Okay, back on script. Another factor that time loops futz with is character dynamics. Because only the looping character is aware of the time loop, the premise of the time loop story disconnects them from their peers in an absolutely devastating way. While they will remember every conversation and interaction they have with their secondary cast, those characters will lose their memory every time the loop resets. Our hero could have an incredibly meaningful heart-to-heart with a character they care deeply about, and the next day it won't have happened for one of them. This simple twist of fate isolates our hero from absolutely everybody. Some of them do talk to their peers about the loop, but they still have to re-explain it every time through, and it's pretty common for them to be strongly disbelieved, at least in the early loops. The longer the loops continue, the wider the experience gap grows, and the more alienated the looping character becomes. That's easy to play for tragedy, but also consider how deeply unsettling this reads from the perspective of everybody else. One day this dude is your new asshole coworker, and the next he's staring into your eyes with 1,000 years of profound sadness and casually referencing your deepest heart's desire and the tragic death of your old flame. The time loop communication gap can be played for some very interesting tension and dramatic irony, especially if the characters who aren't in the loop start piecing together that a time loop is happening, just from the context clues of how their co-star is suddenly acting. There's a lot a story can do with the information gap between the looping character and their out-of-the-loop peers. While the audience usually starts the story off following the looping character closely, as time drags on and the loops become more familiar, it's common for the story to start just jumping around or skipping ahead, disconnecting the audience from the looping character and potentially enabling some twists about, for example, how many times the looping character has tried something already. I want to highlight Edge of Tomorrow because it does some really fascinating stuff with its time loop, but the ingredients it uses are very simple. Take a character struggling with a time loop and make his deuteragonist a character who had previously been in a time loop. This immediately makes the dynamic between Cage and Rita uniquely fascinating, because while only Cage is looping, Rita is a veteran time looper and very experienced with exactly what he's dealing with. He doesn't need to waste any time explaining that he's in a time loop, he can just prove it in 5 seconds and catch her up. But there's an interesting element to their dynamic that grows over time, which is that Rita is extremely closed off and private, but by the midpoint of the movie, Cage has spent who knows how many loops with her, and in those loops, she's revealed information about herself that her current version denies or deflects. Which begs the question, how close have they gotten in those unseen previous loops for her to have volunteered that information? She's always going through this loop for the first time. It's always the first time she's met him, but every time through the loop, Cage gets closer with her. Their relationship grows more intimate at the same time the information gap between them widens. This culminates in a very good scene where the audience and Rita slowly realize that Cage is way too familiar with the random farmhouse he's parked them in for a break, and he eventually admits that he's gotten this far way too many times, but he cannot figure out how to keep Rita alive beyond this point. He was trying to play it cool so they could steal a few precious moments of peace between death loops, but Rita doesn't have the luxury of infinite time loops and infinite chances, so as soon as he owns up, she does what she's done every time before, charges headlong to try and take out the threat, and gets herself killed. Their relationship is fascinatingly asymmetrical. Cage is inevitably falling deeper and deeper in love with her, and she knows it, but for her it's always the first day they've met, and the mission to stop the war is always more important than whatever feelings he's developing for her. It's a really intricate little bit of relationship writing that really leverages the time loop for everything it's capable of. Also, is she called Rita because Rita is also the name of the love interest in Groundhog's Day? Because if so, this is the funniest possible AU they could have done for Groundhog Day. Like, it's Groundhog Day, but what if they were ground troops during an alien invasion and Phil was played by Tom Cruise? But that specific little bit of dawning horror of, wait, how many times have we done this, is a time loop trope that I think is really fun, and weirdly, one of my favorite examples of it comes from an episode of The Batman, the 2004 animated show that wasn't tied in with any of the DC animated series that were coming out in that same window. Overall, I think the show is decently okay with a few strikingly high points, especially in Season 4, and one of them is Season 4 Episode 9, Seconds. also known as the Clock King episode. Yeah, the Clock King episode is the best episode of the show. What I think makes this such a fun version of the time loop is that the time loop centers on the antagonist of the episode. He has the superpower to rewind time. Not much, only 20 seconds, but he uses this to basically save Scum his crimes. In the opener to the episode, he bumbles his way through a robbery, and at the moment the guard catches him, he rewinds to the beginning, avoids all the pitfalls he hit the last time, and makes a clean and effortless getaway. After this point, we spend most of the episode following the POV of our heroes, Batman, Robin, and Batgirl, as they try to figure out how to deal with this weirdly super competent criminal who seems to be prepared for everything they try. Because of course, if the bad guy is time looping, when our heroes beat him, he can just hit the nuh-uh button and rewind with full knowledge of their next move and how to avoid it. And if he trips up, he can just try again until he gets it right. He even rewinds a couple times just so he can use a better one-liner. The first time we see Batman fight him, we follow the Clock King's POV. We see him get whacked and walloped, and then he rewinds until he's able to win and gets away scot-free, making this the canon timeline that really happens and retconning our Bat hero's victory out of existence. Batman even notices that the fight seemed weirdly staged, like his opponent had rehearsed it somehow. That's cool, but very standard stuff for a time loop. What's really cool is what happens the next time our heroes try to intercept his criming, and our POV stays locked onto our heroes instead of our villain. As soon as they arrive, Batman gets a feeling of deja vu, and it becomes slowly clear to both him and the audience that whatever's about to happen, it's happened before. And because the villain of the episode has control over the time loops, it's safe to assume that if our heroes were going to win this version of the encounter, we wouldn't be seeing this loop, because he wouldn't let it be canon. Sure enough, they get outmaneuvered. A villain who can rewind every time he's beaten is a villain who can't lose. There's another angle on the time loop I want to highlight, specifically circling back to the video game thing, almost like we're in some kind of loop. Because a time loop replicates the internal logic of playing a video game over and over again, some interesting things can happen when you just pass go to collect $200 and make a video game about a time loop. Mechanically, it makes your job very easy. Build out the limited scenario our hero can explore, and don't bother scripting beyond the bounds of the loop, because after a certain point, our hero's just gonna get thrown back to the beginning. But a game that puts the player in the head of someone trapped in a time loop is going to be structurally different than a story that just follows someone trapped in a time loop. Because now it's not just about the character going through all 5 stages of grief, it's also inflicting time loop hell on the player. There's a couple games I want to highlight that basically cover opposite ends of the player versus character spectrum here, so consider this a minor spoiler warning covering the entire rest of the video for some discussion of the baked-in premise of the games In Stars and Time and Outer Wilds. That's right! I played Outer Wilds for this video, because I knew if I didn't, it would be the only thing in my comment section. I sacrificed precious engagement for this. Anyway, In Stars and Time and Outer Wilds both have a lot of things that can be spoiled about them. I personally don't think I spoil anything of critical importance in this video. I don't discuss how either of the games end, but a lot of people say that, oh, Outer Wilds is a kind of game that you have to go into completely blind, and I can't tell you absolutely anything about it. And I personally disagree. I think you can be told mechanics and general vibes-based things about the game without in any way having the experience ruined for you. I don't think I'm going to be spoiling any information that isn't already in the description of the game, but if you want an absolutely spoiler-free playthrough of those games, I hope you enjoyed the video. Okay, so anyway, on the extreme character focus end is In Stars and Time, a game that starts off looking like a pretty standard JRPG-style adventure where your party of plucky misfits teams up to kill God, but it quickly becomes clear that it is in fact time loop horror about inflicting absolute hell on the looping character, Sifrin the party rogue. And while the player is expected to feel increasingly frustrated and hopeless the more times they try and fail to escape the loop, this is all bolstered through Sifrin feeling the exact same way, which simultaneously makes the feeling of time loop hell easier and harder for the player to bear. It can be reassuring when the game basically tells you, hey, I know you're frustrated right now, that's supposed to happen, you're not doing anything wrong, but on the other hand, Sifrin's deteriorating mental state and growing sense of hopeless isolation can get pretty hard to watch. One of the most interesting and heartbreaking elements of the game is Sifrin's increasing inability to see their beloved teammates as real people. In the context of the game, they are real people, but Sifrin has had every conversation with them so many times that they can only see them as actors on a stage at this point, endlessly repeating the same trite and tired dialogue over and over again. Even though it's clear to the player that Sifrin's teammates are far more insightful than he gives them credit for, and as the loops go on, they start breaking their scripting in small ways because they can tell that Sifrin is not doing well emotionally. Mechanically, this allows the game to intentionally invoke the feeling we were talking about at the very beginning. You've played the game too many times, the illusion of depth has been completely completely shattered, the characters you care so deeply about have become nothing more than familiar looping dialogue, you're too powerful for any of the challenges to mean anything anymore, but you still keep coming back, you need to free yourself from the time loop, possibly by putting the game down, because there's nothing left for you here. It is not a good feeling to realize you've exhausted the potential of something that brought you so much joy. But because In Stars and Time is a video game that does this on purpose, it can unpack that concept without actually running out of new things to surprise the player with. It's not just the player becoming acutely aware of the limits on the fiction they're playing around in, it's the main character feeling their world shrinking and collapsing around them, leaving them horribly, crushingly alone while surrounded by the people who love them the most. The meta-narrative of the story is about how important it is to let stories end, but because it's so carefully plotted, the characters in the game can continue to surprise both Siffrin and the player right up until the final loop. In purposefully recreating the feeling of playing a familiar game way too many times, In Stars and Time avoids all the story-weakening pitfalls of endless post-game time loop hell. And on the other end of the spectrum is Outer Wilds, where the main character is a character, in the sense that they exist, but they don't really get much chance to show that off. They're basically just a vessel for the player, and the story and game structure goes a long way towards immersing the player pretty fully in the context of the game, without the character serving as much of a buffer at all. The game camera is strictly first person, the ship's log that saves your permanent progress is written in pretty neutral tones that just kind of clinically describe what you've discovered, and your character figures out and accepts that they're in a time loop very quickly, and then just kind of moves on. It feels a little bit like the character is nothing more than the spacesuit we put on at the beginning of every loop. What they think and feel about what's happening is pretty limited to the sparse dialogue options, since you spend most of the game alone in space and NPCs are extremely rare. And when you do track them down, most of your dialogue options remain unchanged from loop to loop. Your character just doesn't seem to have many thoughts about their situation beyond what's mechanically necessary for the player to understand, or what's a simple cold read on what the player probably wants to say. For instance, when your autopilot steers you into the sun, you get a new dialogue option where you can complain to the spaceship engineer that their autopilot flew you into the sun, because it is a pretty safe bet that you are going to be annoyed about this. Your character has the option at several points to mention that you're in a time loop, but nobody's gonna understand or really believe you. So the player character is pretty much an empty vessel in this game, a tool for exploration. And that means they don't provide much of a buffer between the player and the horrors of the time loop. And having recently experienced the horrors for myself, I gotta say, that game is some top-notch nightmare fuel, but it actually sidesteps a lot of the narrative strengths of the time loop story structure just because the character experiencing the time loop isn't really a character. They don't undergo development independent of the player, their relationship with their peers doesn't evolve. The time loop is there to structurally enable the player to explore this small, doomed solar system and unravel what happened here in the past, why the time loop is happening, and what, if anything, can be done about the situation you're in. Instead, I think what Outer Wilds reveals from a time loop standpoint is less about the character and more about how the player would handle a time loop, which is a very valuable thought experiment, because time loops are one of those tropes that fully cannot happen in real life, which leaves it pretty firmly in the realm of speculation. So going a few rounds in Time Prison Simulator 2K19 can be enlightening for writers of all stripes. Speaking as somebody who loves space in all its forms, Outer Wilds scares the absolute shit out of me. Just like in real life, space in Outer Wilds is cold, airless, unforgiving, disorienting, and full of fascinatingly fresh bullshit just waiting to invent new ways to kill you dead. And it's also great, because you're in a time loop, and that means death doesn't matter. Whatever horrible fate you experience, you'll just wake up at the beginning of the loop again. And every time you die, you learn a little more about all the ways the universe wants to kill you, and you can make it just a little harder for it next time. Now, what was interesting to me when I was playing it is that even though I was very aware that A, it was a video game, and therefore in no way real, and B, it was a time loop video game, and therefore even in-game death was not a threat, I never got desensitized to all the horrible ways Outer Wilds can and will kill you. Getting eaten by anglerfish sucks. Falling into the sun sucks. Running out of oxygen sucks. Getting crushed by a rising tide of sand in a dark, airless cave really sucks. But there are no consequences. The only permanent result of your exploration is that you learn. The game constantly forces you to leap into the terrifying unknown over and over again, and sometimes the unknown kills you, but it can't kill you forever, and you always learn something from it. That unique time loop feeling of incremental progress, of you getting better at whatever it is you're doing because you have more practice, you're finding the shortcuts, you're experimenting with new strategies that only kill you some of the time. And at the same time, the game doesn't force your hand. You do not have to go find new ways to die in space. You can sit down at any campfire and take a nap, or roast a marshmallow and just burn the time you have in excess. You never even have to leave the launch pad. If you want to spend your time running around your home village, talking to absolutely everybody and playing hide and seek with the kids, you can. The game won't stop you. It won't advance the game except by familiarizing you with some of the mechanics, but why shouldn't you take it easy? You're in a time loop. You don't need to go all the time, and you won't face any consequences for slowing down once in a while. The sun's not going anywhere. This is a side to the time loop story that's pretty commonly explored, but usually only briefly and not in a positive context. Most characters in a time loop are stuck in a self-inflicted grind, trying to get good enough to achieve the impossible. But with infinite consequence-free time, you could also take a vacation, take a really long nap, dip out of your job without getting in trouble, and eat your weight in donuts. In a culture of all productivity all the time, absolutely terrified of wasting precious seconds or ruining the future by indulging the present, one of the unique experiences a character in a time loop might try is a good, proper rest where they finally have all the time they need to just reset. But in most time loop stories, this sentiment usually happens in some sort of personal darkest hour, where the hero is on the verge of abandoning all hope, and this loop only serves to prove what'll happen if they don't dedicate themselves to finding a way out. Cage spends one of his Edge of Tomorrow loops drowning his sorrows in a London pub because he's sure it's all hopeless, and that's how he sees firsthand what'll happen if he doesn't find a way to stop the invasion. This fills him with newfound motivation and determination and drives him back into trying to find a way to win. In contrast, in Groundhog Day, Phil spends an early loop eating a giant pile of dessert while he talks about nothing mattering, indulging in excess, something he'd normally avoid to preserve his health or just avoid judgment. And nothing bad happens to him, except that he's still in the time loop, and given endless time and zero repercussions, he gets it all out of his system, and his consequence-free hedonism starts rapidly losing its charm. He can just stay in the time loop and eat donuts forever. It's only when he tries that he learns this forbidden indulgence does not actually fulfill him, and infinite donuts is not enough to outweigh the crushing existential nightmare of the loop. Outer Wilds feels very different, and a lot less judgmental of our hero/player. The goal of the loops is to explore, to understand more about what's happening and what has happened in the past. And if you're just exploring this fun new video game, why not explore the parts of it that don't want you dead? It doesn't mean you won't get back to the main plot eventually. It just means that in a world without consequences, it costs you absolutely nothing to be kind to yourself. The universe doesn't care about anything, least of all how you spend your last 22 minutes. And a cold, uncaring, dying universe might inspire the kind of time loop nihilism that turns repressed protagonists into gleeful, consequence-free monsters, or it might inspire you to sit down, take a nap, spend some of that endless limited time with the people you love, and then go get eaten by another goddamn anglerfish. So, yeah,